Hello, welcome to the second module of the training From Reflection to Inclusion. Today we will address some content related to disability, namely terminology, ways of thinking about disability, relationship between difference and labeling, relevant standards and human rights, and school is for all. This training will have the following objectives. 1. Understand and identify the correct terminology associated with disability. 2. Understand the various approaches inherent to disability, as well as recognizing the contribution of the social approach to the development of an inclusive school. 3. Understand labeling and categorization processes. 4. Identify and recognize pedagogical strategies based on international guiding principles. 5. Recognize access and psychosocial protection as key factors for an inclusive school. There is a discussion around the concept of disability and impairment, and in this sense, it is fundamental to clarify this word. Considering the SIF, the concept of disability is used to refer not only to impairments, but also to the limitations associated to these, as well as to the restrictions that they bring about for the subject. The term disability is associated with the loss of some capacity or some abnormality of the functions of the human body, including mental functions. Simply put, disability is a term used to refer to losses in the level of functions of the human body, while the term impairment defines a disadvantage or even restriction of activity caused by social organization. When we approach the subject of disability, we cannot fail to mention the issue of terminology. Sometimes we use expressions in relation to disability which, in our naivety, we think are correct, but they are not. We can highlight some recurrent expressions, namely A. Person with special needs. B. Disabled person. The use of the two previously mentioned expressions are wrong, as both are offensive, where the idea of ineffectiveness of the subject, as well as the idea that disability is something that can be carried by the subject, are passed on. Despite the example given above, the truth is that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities assumes the designation person with disabilities to be the most correct term to use, since it does not impose any type of discrimination, prejudice, or barriers transmitting a negative or inferior image of people with disabilities. The study on the origin of disability has been approached over the years through development of three models. 1. The model of charity. 2. The medical model. 3. The social model. The first explanation of the origin of disability is reflected in the charity model. This is a rudimentary, archaic way of explaining this phenomenon, where its origin is based on religion. In other words, the origin of disability was perceived and defended as being a divine punishment. In the light of this model, people with disabilities were considered as diabolical. Although still widely used, the medical model breaks with the previous explanation. It gives us a better idea of the origin of disability. According to this model, disability is seen as a consequence of a disease that needs medical intervention. This perspective sees disability as a problem associated to the subject, focusing on the subject's deficit. It is a model which does not consider the barriers to the full participation of people with disabilities. The social model has no emphasis on the disabilities of the subject. This approach brings, for the first time, the idea that the limitations and difficulties of the person with disability are not associated to biological issues, but rather to the few responses to the needs of these subjects on the part of society. When we talk about the issue of inclusion in an educational context, it is essential to use this approach, as it facilitates a better understanding of the difficulties and barriers to the participation and inclusion of these people. Labeling and categorizing have always been part of societies. They are processes used by subjects to characterize and highlight people with behaviors that go beyond pre-established norms. This process is rooted in historical beliefs that can influence how the majority thinks and acts on a given issue, often bringing repercussions at the political level, as well as at the attitudinal and behavioral level. When we bring this discussion to education, we know that the processes of categorization and labeling are based on student diagnosis. Addressing this issue in inclusive education is quite complex, largely due to the various existing perspectives. The truth is that within the various views, there are those who argue that labeling based on diagnosis is important to allocate the necessary resources to meet the educational needs presented by students. However, there are those who argue that diagnosis-based labeling leads to better intervention and consequently to better learning. We know that this issue is complex, and in this sense, Boyle proposes we consider three questions. The first question is if labels can lead to stereotyping as well as stigmatization. Labels correspond to the process by which society creates descriptors to identify people who deviate significantly from the norm. The use of labeling and categorization processes leads to the stereotyping of the subject, that is, negative attributions of those who deviate from established standards of normality. In the educational context, these processes can lead to the inferiorization of the student and consequent alienation from peers. Another issue is that the use of the labels gives comfort to the children as well as to their families. Labeling based on diagnosis can bring comfort to the child and the family itself, as it can explain the source of the problem, leading to stress relief. But the use of these processes can lead to the child taking the blame for the difficulty he presents. In the educational context, the need to categorize is related to the way educational organizations organize themselves to meet the needs of children. A further issue relates to whether or not the labeling process can lead to development of an individualized plan which, in turn, may lead to the inclusion of the student. The use of labeling processes in educational settings can lead to placing students with the same label in the same category without the concern to match teaching methods to the needs and goals of the student themselves. We know that two students with the same diagnosis require different accommodation and methods of teaching and learning. In other words, categorization on the basis of diagnosis does not provide sufficient information for the teacher to draw up a plan with the view to responding to the real needs and interests of the student with disabilities, thus hindering intervention. Focusing exclusively on labels based on diagnosis is not the right way to develop quality inclusive education, as the use of labels leads to low self-esteem in the student. Despite this, some argue that the use of labels in education systems leads students and teachers to focus on difficulties, disregarding students' strengths and abilities. We refer in this manual to some international diplomas that, in fact, regulate not only the right to access to education, but also the access to an equal and equitable inclusive education, as is the case of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Declaration of Salamanca, and Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The truth is that, despite the documents mentioned, it is essential that each national educational system regulates inclusive education according to the purposes of the international diplomas mentioned. Considering the Portuguese case, since the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a set of changes have been initiated, starting with the improvement of the concept of inclusive education, which translated at a legal level into the implementation of Decree Law No. 3 of 2008, and later into Decree Law No. 54 of 2018, which made Portugal one of the countries where inclusive education was successfully implemented. Focusing on the most recent document, the Decree Law No. 54 of 2018, we have that it defends the idea that all students have the potential to learn as long as they are given all the essential resources for their learning needs. To this end, there is a set of methodological options associated with this law, namely A. Universal design for learning, B. Multi-level approach. This is an organization by levels of intervention which vary from the type, intensity, and frequency of the interventions, as well as the students' responses to them. The adoption of these new methodological options involves the implementation of the following measures: A. Universal measures, B. Selective measures, and C. Additional measures. In addition to the above, Portugal also has other guiding instruments, namely the National Strategies for People with Disabilities and the National Strategies for the Rights of the Child. We share some guidelines which we consider assertive and which are included in the Portuguese National Strategy for People with Disabilities. To create a support network that ensures an effective response to complement school hours for children and young people with disabilities, enabling them to stay outside school hours and develop leisure time activities and inclusive holidays. Nevertheless, we can also mention the need to deepen the inclusive education model in the access to quality educational and training opportunities. Here we highlight to reinforce the training of directors, general counsel, multidisciplinary team, teachers, and operational assistants. Ensuring access is one of the many characteristics of an inclusive school. This is also clearly stated in Article 9 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, it is not enough for this idea to be enshrined. It is essential that the education systems provide the necessary resources for the full access of people with disabilities, namely to education. There are a number of aspects that can jeopardize disabled people's access to quality inclusive education. In this sense, the UNESCO database on the education of children with disabilities mentions, for example, lack of knowledge about pupils' educational needs, lack of trained teachers, lack of adequate pedagogical support in the classroom environment, and lack of accessible facilities. Throughout the learning process of students with special educational needs, little emphasis is given to emotional and social issues. The truth is that the difficulties of these individuals are not only related to the acquisition of learning in reading, arithmetic, and writing, but also to emotional and social issues that should not be neglected. According to the American Psychiatric Association, specific learning difficulties can have lifelong consequences, like psychological suffering, A. rejection, B. isolation, C. peer pressure, D. low self-esteem, and E. low self-efficacy. Safe schools and non-formal learning spaces are some of the positives for children and adolescents going through a period of uncertainty. Intentional investment in education-based psychosocial support is key in the sense that it promotes students' routines, development of stable friendships, and consequently leads to stress reduction and promotes self-expression and collaboration. SEL, social emotional learning methods, are a process by which all individuals acquire a set not only of knowledge, but also of skills and attitudes as a way of developing emotionally healthy people who know how to deal with their emotions. These should be integrated into the different areas of young people's lives. Bringing children together with peers, parents, families, and the community creates a supportive environment that fosters greater psychosocial well-being. When we apply these methods to students with educational needs, we have, in fact, studies that indicate their positive impact, namely in reducing aggressive behavior and antisocial behavior. They also report that these methods contribute to positive attitudes towards the student, their peers, and their learning. It should be noted that there are programs aimed at promoting social and emotional skills that have proved positive when applied to students with educational needs. As an example, we share PATHS program, whose effectiveness evaluation has shown A. A reduction in behavior problems such as aggression at school for both regular and special needs pupils. B. Decrease in depression and sadness among pupils with special educational needs. Kids Matter. This is a national SEL framework implemented in Australian schools. This initiative was developed in order to A. Decrease mental health difficulties, B. Improving the well-being of pupils with disabilities during preschool and early primary education. Students with educational needs present a set of difficulties that must be overcome by applying appropriate responses to them. Help during work in the classroom context. Need for adequate monitoring and activities such as reading, writing, and understanding information. Help to express an idea and/or understand the information transmitted by the interlocutor. Support in interacting with colleagues and teachers. These are some of the inherent needs of pupils with educational needs. In the field of education, inclusion involves a process of reform and restructuring of schools as a whole, with the aim of ensuring that all learners can access the full range of educational and social opportunities offered by the school. This includes the current curriculum, assessment, recording, and reporting of students' academic achievements, the decisions being made about the grouping of students in schools or classrooms, pedagogy and classroom practices, and opportunities for sport, leisure, and recreation. In order to consolidate the contents covered, we would like to propose a reflection on the importance of the social model of disability in the paradigm shift of inclusive education, guided by the following topics. What is the social approach to disability? How does this approach facilitate the inclusion process of students with disabilities? We hope that this module has added value and knowledge about the various approaches to disability. We suggest you consult the handbook for further study. We propose some additional resources that complement what we have mentioned here. We welcome your feedback on the link indicated in the summary of this video.